Thank you, Diane. Sorry, I just accepted the recording. Good morning, everyone. As Diane mentioned, my name is Arwen Kassebaum, and I'm so excited to have the opportunity to reconnect with someone I really admire, Rita McGrath. As Diane mentioned, she is a globally recognized expert on strategy, innovation, and entrepreneurship. She is ranked by Thinkers 50 as one of the top strategic thinkers globally. It's kind of a big deal. She's also a professor at Columbia. I'm so proud of you for that. She's a professor at Columbia Business School, where she really focuses on executive education. She's also the author of 2 best-selling and award-winning books, The End of Competitive Advantage and Seeing Around Corners, which we will be talking a little bit more about today. She, as Diane mentioned, she is a prolific writer. Her articles can often be found in Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, and many, many others. In her spare time, because she has so much, she's also been working on a set of tools to make innovation a lot less painful, and it includes some really cool software that I got a sneak peek of at one point that is definitely worth checking out. So all that said, it'd be an understatement to say we're glad to have her here to chat with us. And we're going to jump right into navigating strategic inflection points, if that sounds good. So Rita, I briefly mentioned your latest book, Seeing Around Corners. And this does focus on spotting inflection points before they happen, rather than after, which is really what we've been trained to do. So could you tell us a little bit more about that and what inspired you to write this book?
Well, the concept of inflection points was first talked about popularly by Andy Grove back in the 90s in his fabulous book, Only the Paranoid Survive, which I read then and loved, and it sort of stuck with me as a way of thinking about big changes. And I think when I think of popular business terms like disruption, I mean, disruption has kind of come to mean anything. When Clayton Christensen, who made it popular, had a very specific definition for it. But I actually started to think that the concept of inflection points was actually more useful. So I define a strategic inflection point as some change, typically in the environment, that creates a 10x shift in something that used to be true, typically about your business or your life or your society. So 10x cheaper, 10x faster, 10x more convenient. And what inspired me to what crystallized the idea behind the book for me was when someone sent me an article, and the article was called, "What if you changed the world and nobody noticed?" And the central case of the article was about the Wright brothers and manned flight. And, we all know now, yes, of course, that created an inflection point of like unprecedented dimensions. But at the time, it was such a novel idea that a lot of people just didn't believe it, couldn't grasp it. It took 3 years before any major newspaper actually covered it. And one of the most telling incidences from that period to me is there were people on the ground in North Carolina, literally looking up in the sky and seeing these guys flying around in planes and not believing the evidence of their own eyes, because it must be an optical illusion. It's a circus trick. This can't be true. I mean, talk about the original like reality deniers, right? But that's just, it's such a perfect metaphor for me, for why so many of us miss inflection points. It's because our worldview just does not include the possibility that they exist.
And what inspired, was that the inspiration behind the entire?
Well, that's what made it come together, because what I realized was, I mean, what that made me think about was the wonderful line from Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises, when one character asks another, well, how did you go bankrupt? And the reply was, well, 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly. And what I realized, and what prompted me to actually put this in book form, was that's the opportunity. Because these things, when they happen, they feel like they came out of nowhere. Like March of 2020, didn't it feel like the pandemic came out of nowhere? And yet, if you go back, there were people who not only said something like this, it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when. And they were very specific about what country it would come from, how it would spread, where it would go, what effects it was likely to have. And this goes back 10 years. And I think what's fascinating about that is if you get the early warning signs that these things are underway and you start watching for them, when the inflection point arrives, you can be resilient and ready. And if you just miss them, you're kind of where we all are now, which is, we've been struggling with not being prepared and not being resilient for quite some time now. But I think the impetus, the opportunity was, it takes a long time. Overnight changes take forever, right? Look at autonomous vehicles, just as a case in point. I mean, how long have we been talking about autonomous vehicles? At least since the Jetsons, and that was 1962. And it still hasn't happened.
And so as we come out of the pandemic, so, to your point, this did feel very sudden, but, there were warning signs and people did see it coming, and preparations had been made, not sufficient, but preparations had been made. What do you see as the biggest issue for leaders, particularly women leaders, as we come out of this pandemic? What things have you spotted, anything that you don't think enough attention has been paid that really could hit us in the face?
Well, I think there are opportunities, and I think there are warning signs. And clearly the warning signs are women have disproportionately borne the brunt of the pandemic on so many dimensions, caregiving, childcare, uneven distribution of work at home, and career progress. One of the things I'm very concerned about is, because of a lot of reasons, women are probably going to elect more flexible, hybrid work options. And one of the things we know about careers is that you tend to do better. And Peter Capelli from Wharton and I were just talking about this on a fireside chat recently. There's pretty strong evidence that if you're a remote worker, you just advance less quickly. You are seen to be promotable less frequently, and it's sort of sight out of mind. So I think there's that. I think not necessarily pandemic related, but we're starting to really get our heads around the numbers that accompany, I'll call them micro discriminations. And this is not the intentional, obvious, wolf whistle stuff. This is, there was a researcher who built a simulation model. And what she did was she took research on what happens to women in the workplace. For example, if a woman and a man complete an equivalent project with equivalent quality and equivalent time, the woman is generally given less credit for it than the man is. So let's say she gets 3 points, he gets 5. And these things accumulate. So what this computer simulation does is it goes through, cycle after cycle of half-year promotion reviews, but it burdens the female actors, the agents in the sim, with these sort of micro, I don't know what you call it, micro setbacks. And then what you find is if you start off with a population that's 50-50 at the beginning of a career, and the women are constantly having these micro setbacks, right? It's almost like watching, and the article is accompanied by an illustration of a bunch of men riding an escalator and women carrying a ladder. And so I think the pandemic is likely to exacerbate all that. And so I think what it opens up is the chance for leaders who really get it to start to make some interventions that could make a difference. And it requires effort, though. And this is the thing. And I think when it comes to diversity, inclusion, so many of these topics that are so important, you have to work at it. And I mean, I hear that people whining, like, oh, it's so much work. I'm like, duh, it's work worth doing. And I know for myself, like when I try to staff a course with diverse talent, I run out of my network pretty quickly. And so you do have to reach out and make more of an effort, and try to kind of access communities that aren't easy. But I definitely think that is totally worth doing.
Fantastic. So as we think about these micro discriminations, the additional effort required to reach diverse communities, as well as the downside to being a remote and or hybrid worker, are there any other arenas that you think that women should pay close attention to prevent further backslide? Because it doesn't feel as though that there's some inertia, and it doesn't feel like it has stopped quite yet. Is there anything else that you think we should pay extra attention to?
Well, I do think networks, and of course, Quorum is a great example of that, are a way of creating a supportive community that can help. And there's a ton of research that shows your networks is how you get access to resources, access to information, access to finance in some cases, access to, you know, communities you wouldn't otherwise know about. So one thing I do think is maybe a benefit of the pandemic is you don't have to actually like get on a train, go to the city, find a coffee shop and meet with someone now. You know, people are much more open to, hey, can I get on a Zoom with you for half an hour? And so I think there's, you know, there's some lowered barriers to entry to meeting people that you might like to meet, being proactive about your building your network, you know, helping each other. So I think there's that. You know, I think there are things women can do for themselves, and then organizations have to step up too. So I was just talking to someone who studies burnout in the workforce, and I mean, this drives me crazy. It's like, do yoga, meditate every day, you know, exercise, self-care, and that's all great. But if you're in a toxic work situation, you can be as mindful as you like. It's not going to necessarily be better. So I think figuring out the structural places where we could begin to have an impact, and, you know, making it clear what those are to people that are making decisions is an activity I think women can get involved with, building alliances. And then, you know, providing guidance on what could make it easier.
Amazing. So going back to inflection points that aren't specifically focused on women leaders and gender biases, what sorts of questions are you getting from your students at Columbia about strategies and tactics for
a ton. Well, so I think one of the kind of interesting things about the pandemic, and this was underway before the pandemic, but the pandemic, as it has so many things, has really accelerated this, is people are now starting to recognize that we're in conditions of high uncertainty. And many of us have never been trained to deal with that. You know, we get trained to deal with, there's first grade and then there's second grade and then there's third grade, and we know what that looks like, and we know what the day is structured like, and, you know, our business is going to be very similar to the way it was last year, and we're really comfortable in that kind of environment. But to be able to say, let's move on over to a high uncertainty situation, a lot of people have never had to really learn to cope with those. So I think one of the things that I'm seeing now, and executives are definitely reporting, is I don't know where to start. You know, I don't know what tools to use. I know my old tools aren't fit for purpose, but I don't know what I should be replacing them with. I know innovation is on the agenda, but I don't know how to get past innovation theater. How can I even formulate strategy when the world is, you know, changing so rapidly? So those kinds of questions. And I think the root cause really is this massive amount of uncertainty. And none of us have the choice right now to be in any condition other than massively uncertain. And I can't tell you in 6 months whether we're going to be back to traveling and feeling comfortable, you know, in large gatherings with strangers or not. You know, we're already seeing evidence in some parts of the world of another wave, you know, and another variant. And, you know, like, we just don't know. And I'm not saying that's good. I'm saying it's created the demand for a whole lot of new ways of thinking.
Spectacular. So I would like to open the floor up to questions from everyone who joined us this morning. Is there anyone who would like to ask Rita anything specific? You can either send your questions through chats, or if you want to raise your hand. We're a small group, so we can make it very personal today.
Rita, this is Meg. I was wondering, you know, how do you recommend that leaders actually keep their eyes open to see around these corners? I mean, what do you think it takes to do that? I'm sure that's a big part of what you talked about in your book, but I think this group would benefit from that.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think the first barrier is recognizing you need to do it at all. So I think the first problem is, I think, lifting your nose out of your emails and whatever the busyness of the day-to-day is, and saying, okay, I need to take some time on my calendar and do this. And then once you've decided that you're going to do that, there's a set of techniques that you can use that can be helpful. So the first one is, are you personally putting yourself in a position where you're exposed to what's going on at the edges? And so a great example of a guy that did this was Gisbert Ruhl, who was the former CEO of a company called Klockner, very traditional German metal services company, just very hierarchical, doors with offices, all that. And he wanted to take a digital transformation approach to changing their business. And one of the things that concerned him was his middle managers, right, would block any effort at change and would just not let him communicate directly with the front lines. So one of the things he did was he put in what he calls non-hierarchical communication, which was essentially Yammer. But he gave everybody in the company a Yammer account and sent out the message that if there was anything going on, anyone saw that they thought was worthy of his attention, that they should communicate that to him. And then what he did to seed this, because of course at the beginning nobody believed him, but to seed this, he spent about 2 hours a day on Yammer, sending messages, right, to people, responding to questions as they came back. And eventually what happened was people started to talk to each other on Yammer. Oh, and the other thing he did was he made sure that when the messages came into his inbox, whoever was sort of lowest on the totem pole hierarchically, their messages would float to the top of his feed, so that he heard from the people that were kind of lowest status-wise first. And it really changed the organization. He was hearing from, tool and die people saying, there's a real problem with the way this thing is manufactured, and it deserves a look from somebody. And so that's one. Another one is, making sure you have diverse points of view in the room when you're making important decisions. And a story I love to tell about that is, I was actually part of an audience for a pitch that was being made by the team, very young people, sponsoring this Link NYC device. So the idea was, you take all the payphones out of the city of New York and you replace them with these internet kiosks. And I remember asking this team, just to give you context, all Ivy League educated, all either business school students or engineers, very homogenous, all educated at the same schools, all mastering in the same subject. So pretty homogenous team. And I remember asking them, so, what do you think people are going to do with these kiosks? And they said, oh, it's going to be fantastic. They're going to look up where the artisanal cheese shop is, and they're going to find out what the hours for the farmer's market are. It's going to be great. In other words, the people using these things would do with them what the people who are part of the design team would do. Well, of course, they roll these things out, and within 48 hours, you have people setting up encampments and watching YouTube like all day long. You got guys plugged into the internet, like rocking out next to the machines. You got people doing pretty unspeakable things in tourist areas. I mean, just like the worst sort of behavior of humanity. Leaving that aside, I think if they had someone weighing in on the design who knew something about what goes on the streets of the city of New York, you wouldn't have made that mistake. So that's another technique. Having small, diverse teams that are empowered to do things. And the way you get to that is by giving them real clarity about strategy, objectives, goals, their roles, what it is we're trying to accomplish, but then step back from the control approach, right? So if you have that clarity, chances are you really don't need committees. You don't need, big process controls. People kind of know what to do. And this, for example, would be what they did at Netflix. They made a very conscious decision to create a culture where this high talent density group of employees they recruited could make decisions about areas at surprisingly, I'll call it low hierarchical levels. They're very flat, by the way, but people who were young, it would take them, they'd have to be 10 years more experience to make a decision such as that at Disney would be an example. And so people are very attracted to Netflix because of the freedom that it gives them, but it comes with a responsibility, right? Which is you have to be accountable, you have to kind of live up to your commitments and so forth. A couple of other things. And there's a whole chapter in the book on this, but are you creating an environment where people feel comfortable talking about uncomfortable things, where people aren't just giving you as the leader what they think you want to hear, but where they're bringing up things that maybe you hadn't thought about, or if you have a preference about what happens in the future, but the reality isn't working out that way, do you have an environment where people feel they can bring that kind of information to you. And I think that's hard. It's hard because we're all human, and we all have bodies. And when we hear something that isn't particularly attractive or consistent with our previously held notions, you can sometimes signal that you're not very pleased to hear that. So it's really important, I think, to embrace an environment of curiosity, to be genuinely interested in well, that didn't conform to my previous expectations. Let's explore that. And to make people feel safe, coming to you with things that are uncomfortable. So there's tips like that throughout the book that I think you can absolutely put into practice, like this afternoon.
Let's see. Diane has a question. It's in the chat. As she mentioned, she follows you on LinkedIn. Recently, you shared a quote by William Gibson. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. And she's asking if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Oh, sure. So he's a science fiction writer. And what I love about science fiction writers is they really do see, these possible worlds before the rest of us do. And what William Gibson meant by that was that as I said, gradually, then suddenly, anything that's eventually going to be meaningful and important new technology shows up somewhere in the fringes. So it's here, it exists. So as an example, AT&T launched a picture phone in 1964. And they launched it commercially so they displayed a picture phone in 1964 at the World's Fair, and they launched it commercially in Pittsburgh for sale in 1970. A picture phone. And of course, it didn't work out because it was very early. The ecosystem wasn't there. The bandwidth wasn't there. It was too expensive, blah, 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 blah. But that didn't mean that the demonstrated belief that a picture phone would sometimes be part of humanity's fate has not existed for a long, long time. So the picture phone existed in 1964, but we didn't have real, like this kind of use for picture phones till decades later. And so that's a little bit of the future that appeared before it was obvious to everybody. And if you think about it, how do you get yourself exposed to those kinds of things? Go to an industry conference that's not your industry. Take some time and, explore an artist that perhaps you wouldn't normally spend much time on. Take a look at opportunities to see new technologies. Things like trade shows and exhibits can sometimes do that. So I think it's a question of making the time to say, hey, what could be out there that is not evenly distributed yet? So I'll give you an example. There's a whole suite of technologies called XR technologies. So automated reality, augmented reality, those headset things where you're like immersive reality. And there's a lot of early evidence that these are in the future. It is highly likely that we will use those kinds of technologies to vastly supplement our own senses. With, who knows what that'll all lead to, but I can give you an example from right now today. One of my clients is a company called Ulteak, and they're an engineering services design firm. And they were working with one of their big clients, who's an energy distribution company. And the trouble is with COVID, like if you wanted to diagnose an issue in a plant, like in the early days, you couldn't have 10 engineers crammed into a little underground space to figure it out. So what they did was they took a Microsoft HoloLens, one of those augmented reality headsets. It's equipped with a camera, and they sent one guy into the site, and then everybody else was, at home on Zoom or in the conference room, one or the other. And this guy though could walk around the site and flip the switches and show what he saw and show what the readings were, and do virtually what previously they would have sent an engineering team to go and bottle, troubleshoot and so forth. And so to me, that's an example of early stage, right? But in the future, those environments are going to be smart themselves, right? They're going to have intelligence built into them and sensing built into them. And they're going to know to call you when they're in trouble, In fact, they may not even call you. They'll call the robot next door and say, dude, could you flip this switch a little? And it's going to be really interesting.
It's amazing. We also have a question from Patricia Roberts, and she asks, what do you see around the corner for higher education and the cost of it? And Rita, I know at this point, 2 years ago, you and I were discussing this. So I'd be interested to hear what your 2021 thoughts are.
Okay, well, it's more of an evolution of what's been going on. So I think a couple of things that were already underway before the pandemic and have been to some extent highlighted and accelerated as a consequence. So the first thing I think that we're starting to see is a real movement to assess people on the basis of skills rather than a degree. So some early evidence of this is you've got Google at Work, I think they call it, where Google offers these free courses. And if you make it through the free courses, you get a certificate and you get the high probability of a job offer from Google. Now, most of the people that start don't complete because it's very, very, very demanding. But if you have the chops for it, you actually can, say, transition from a non-technical to a technical role by enrolling in this course. And I think it's I want to say 3 months, pretty intense 3 months. So you see degree boot camps, right? You see people getting these credentials other ways. So that's one big trend. So imagine that what that means for higher ed, right, is that you can almost think of college like a compact disc. You have to buy 18 songs to get the one that you want. And so as with the compact disc, once that degree gets unbundled, that whole economic model starts to fall apart. Because one of the things the pandemic taught an awful lot of people is that the content of the classroom was just kind of a necessary byproduct to the physical presence on a campus, that's really what added the value that made people willing to spend ridiculous amounts of money to send their kids off to school. So I think there's a whole unbundling, rethinking where the value is in that whole system. A second huge pressure is coming because it's just too expensive for too many people to support that model. I mean, it's a luxury good, college, and too much college debt, too much, too many courses that don't actually lead to an outcome. And I'm not, by the way, saying higher education should be a vocational school. I don't think that's true. But I think when people go off on their lofty talk about, oh, we need people to be educated citizens and this and that, the liberal arts, what they forget is that image of what a college student is so far from reality. It represents about 1 in 4 students in that sort of 18 to 22. Far more are people who started school, got into some kind of personal situation, ended up dropping out, ended up not liking it, ended up not completing. And so they got the worst of both worlds. They've got some debt or some commitment, and they don't have a degree. So another trend that I think is troubling and that I think hopefully will be corrected is a lot of the degree inflation. It's been shown to be massive degree inflation. There are fields in which 62% of the people holding the job do not have a degree, and it's required for new applicants to that self-same job. And the reason for that, I believe, is the automation of job boards, and so you got a computer algorithm that basically looks at your job requirements, turns it into a sorting mechanism, and tosses everybody out who doesn't precisely meet that mold. And I think we're starting to see real alarm on the part of people that are worried about the workforce and worried about good jobs, that this is happening, that there are perfectly qualified people who are never getting a chance at getting a foot in the door because there's some mismatch between their theoretical qualifications and their ability to do the job. So one of the things I'm hopeful about is that as we start to get better at ascertaining what people can do, rather than the degree that they hold. In other words, the degree is a proxy for certain skills. The degree is a proxy for I got out of bed every day and I finished my assignments and I showed up on time and I paid my tuition. And that's a signal of a lot of other stuff, but it doesn't actually tell you whether these people can do the job or not.
So Rita, that's part of the beauty of the education that you provide at Columbia. You teach executives, so it's really laser focused. And Diana is asking what classes you would like to see added to that curriculum.
Oh, wow. To the exec ed or to the MBA?
Diane?
Exec ed.
Oh, exec ed? We're actually pretty good. I mean, the great thing about exec ed as opposed to the MBA is exec ed has a connection to market forces, right? Like, so if you're offering a marketing class that hasn't changed its curriculum since 1997, no one will sign up. So that class kind of goes away. So we have much more of a Darwinian process in the exec ed area than we do in the MBA. What we have been doing, and I'm pleased about this, and I wasn't behind this, but we've been adding a lot more content on digital. And what that means and how you become a digital leader. We've had a lot more content on diversity. And, you know, it's great to say, yes, I'm behind diversity and inclusion, but how do you do that? Like, what do you actually have to do to make that a reality in your company? We've added classes on building resilience as part of your leadership journey. There's a completely redesigned Women in Leadership program, which we've got going now. So I think the exec ed curriculum's not bad on kind of trying to stay up to date with modern things. Incidentally, one of the things that's helped us a lot is because we haven't been able to have people in person, because exec ed, you know, our participants come from all over the world, and navigating visas and testing, and then it's just, today it's just unlikely. I mean, you could do it probably if you had everybody coming from one company, but our typical open enrollment programs, it's just too difficult. So they're all live online, right? They're all or online altogether. But what's beautiful about that is our fixed cost to put out something like that into the world is practically nothing. And so if you want to experiment with a course now, you know, Columbia for years used to be, you could never try anything that was too risky, because they're looking at, oh my God, I've got to reserve a conference room, and I've got to figure out catering, and I've got to encounter all this fixed cost just to run this experiment. One of the great things about live online is we can do this without having to incur all those costs. So we can actually afford to be a lot more experimental, which I think is fun. Now, not everybody likes that, but those that do actually now can get access to the resources to do it.
Fantastic. Let's see if we have any more questions. There's one. In the executive education, do you find that students' how do you find students' previous experience factors in to what they get out of those courses?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. So a big part of executive education is, you know, similar to what we're doing here. It's blending experiences and differences and diverse points of view, that you learn as much from each other as participants as you do from the faculty, for sure. I just finished a course. I was teaching it last week, an online live course. We literally, in a group of about 25 people, we had people from Nigeria. We had a gentleman from Australia. I mean, they're 14 hours different from New York Eastern. So the class started at 11 o'clock. So he's literally sitting down to class at 2 a.m. Australia time. We had people from the Philippines. So you had this just vast mix of diverse people coming in, lots of different companies. We had family-owned companies that sell, you know, food ingredients. We had a couple of self-made entrepreneurs. We had a guy who's a VC investor. So just all that diversity. And then you take that diversity and focus it on a topic. And what you get is just a really different point of view than you might have gotten if you just been working with your own work team on it. So I think it brings an incredible richness to the what you want to call it, the classroom experience.
Do we have any other questions for Rita? I just switched to gallery view, and there are all these faces. It's wonderful.
Hey, Rita, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about the whole digital movement and what that means for leadership. And you just talked about that being one of the types of courses in the exec ed. What does that actually focus on, just out of curiosity for folks here as
sure.
leaders?
So let's talk a little bit about digital and digital transformation, because I think it's very misunderstood. So let's start off with what is digital. And if you ask people what is digital, you get this range of, you know, get me some of that blockchain. Oh, it's AI. Oh, it's, you know, this other stuff. Digital really comes down to a fairly simple definition. To go digital means you're connecting and adding intelligence to things. So you're adding an intelligence layer and you're adding a connectivity layer to two things. Now that could be two people, that could be two buildings, that could be two machines. But essentially what that's doing is it's creating a connection where there never was one before. So the next ring, if you will, of things people don't expect when you start to do that is we make a lot of assumptions about things like security. You know, when things are analog and they're not connected, you actually have to like open the door and go in the room, pull out the file drawer and lift the piece of paper. And that requires enormous effort. In academia, we call that surge cost, right? What digital does in many cases, it connects these things in a way that's really simple. So email would be just an ordinary example. I mean, if those of us old enough to remember, cast your mind back to the days of the typed, Xeroxed, stamped, filed memo. You know, it could take a week to issue a request and receive a response. I mean, much slower and much less connected. So among the things that digital does is it creates connections, but sometimes those connections lead to unexpected, unanticipated outcomes. And we see that all the time with digital. I mean, social media would be currently in the news as one. So yeah, it's great to let all of humanity, you know, do their thing, but all of humanity doing their thing over all of humanity's existence that is why we have governments and rules and laws and enforcement. It's because all of humanity does not have the hearts of angels. And so, you know, these unexpected consequences, I think, are something you need to be alert to. A couple of other things digital does, it accelerates, right? It makes things go faster. And this is where strategy comes in, because something going faster that isn't going in the right direction isn't really helpful. So that's another thing about digital. The last thing I guess I would say about digital is, you know, if you cast your mind back to sort of 1900, right? In factories at that time were right in the middle of a very interesting transition. So factories historically were made to build on a single power source. So it could be a river, it could be a mill, it could be a steam engine, but the whole factory was set up because there was this shaft, right, that carried the power from whatever the power source was to all the different parts of the machines in the building. And so all the machines were built to maximize the benefit that they would get from this shaft. And I went back and looked at the history, and some of these things are incredibly ingenious. They've got like multiple floors of the factory with pulleys going up and down and flippers and drawers, and very interesting. But a couple of things about those kinds of factories. They were 24/7 because you just couldn't turn the steam engine on and off, right? You couldn't turn the river on and off. So they were meant to be operated more or less continuously. So that meant every machine had to be on all the time. They were environmentally horrible places to work as a general rule. They were noisy and dirty and very loud and all that sort of thing. So along comes electrification. And what does electrification do? Well, electrification now means every machine can like do its own thing because it's not dependent on this central power source. And so you could have a machine that could run for 4 hours a day and be off the rest of the time. You could have machines like configured in a really different way. Now, here's the interesting thing. It took about 60 years from the time electrification became kind of feasible to the time it was sort of the preferred way of building a factory, 60 years. And you think about why that is, and why that is it required a completely revolutionary way of thinking about your asset, your factory. It required learning new skills. It required, you know, getting new equipment. It required writing off old assets, blah, 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 blah. Big change. I would say digital today is analogous to that, right? Digital makes these things possible. It's almost like the today equivalent of machines now able to operate independently. And so to me, like asking people, well, what's your digital strategy? It's kind of like asking people, what's your electricity strategy, right? It's going to become so embedded in how things work that we're going to sort of forget that there was a time we didn't have that connectivity and information flow between us. But I think we're at early stages in what this revolution is going to lead to. So here's some sort of things I'm seeing. First thing that's interesting, and this relates to digital, is value is increasingly going from products and services, right? So I buy a hammer because it's really good quality and it's got a titanium head and it's got all this other stuff. Well, it's moving from those kinds of value in products and services to value from interactions. So think about how much more valuable a hammer is if it could give you information about how it was being used, who was using it, where it was being used, what the weather conditions were where it was being used, what the surrounding materials were that it was working with, what kinds of projects it was working on. I mean, your head can explode if you think about the value of a hammer plugged into an interaction field relative to a hammer that's just a hammer evaluated like a product. And I think that's going to take a lot of people by surprise, because these interaction fields are going to create value that's quite separate from the things that go into it. So that's one. I think work is really going to go from, call it a factory model, to much more of a project-based flow model. And this is going to be an enormous transition. And I think we're in the middle of it, and we're couching it in words like hybrid work, or, you know, flexible, or work from home. I think we're missing the deep underlying tectonic shift, which is that work is flow now. You know, work is not, I come into the office, I stamp my thing 400 times a day, I leave. Work is now, this thing came up at 10 o'clock, I responded, maybe next Thursday it'll require something, it's a flow. You know? And when we talk about the design of offices, we talk about the design of work, I've not seen a lot of conversation about the fact that the nature of what creates value in an interaction field world is going to be really different, I think. So that's something that is quite, to me, distinctive. The other thing I think that's interesting is if you think about when people need to be together as opposed to being digitally intermediated. Peter Capelli talks about a continuum, you know, where independent contributor work, right? So I review patent filings, or, you know, I transcribe discs or whatever it is. So my work is not actually dependent on interacting much with anybody else. And you take that and have a continuum all the way over to really creative problem solving work, like what Pixar does, right? That kind of work is really hard to do digitally. You know, you really, there is a huge benefit from human connection and human interaction in that kind of work. So it's going to be very interesting to me how we design our flows of work to accommodate those two, that continuum of different kinds of activity.
Amazing. Are there any other questions from the group? Let's see here. Sophia is asking, do you have any tips for working mothers to maintain a balance?
Oh, working mothers. As a one who was a working mother for many, many years.
You still are a working mother.
We have many working mothers. Okay, well, I'd say tip number one, stop beating up on yourself. You know? Margaret Mead was perfectly happy with grilled steaks and steamed asparagus and boiled potatoes for dinner. She was not making, you know, the the handmade, crafted, you know, whatever it was from, you know, the garden this morning stuff. So I think a lot of working mothers have gotten sucked into this, you know, not only do you have to like keep things together, but it has to be perfect. And you know, my kids are fine. They are in their 30s. Fish fingers made a rather regular appearance on our menu. It did not kill them, you know. And so I think just like let's take a load off if you can. I mean, that's kind of the first thing. Second thing is if you have a partner or a spouse, and that partner or spouse does stuff, let them continue to do it. It may not be up to your standards, but if it's done, it's done. And I would also be honest with your partner, spouse, significant other about stuff like emotional labor. Like, you know, like let's write out all the stuff that's got to happen to keep a human family together, and let's divvy this up in a more fair way. So I'll do the birthday cards if you do the gymnastics run, you know, and let's make it clear whose responsibility is whose. I mean, I know for me, one of the things that drove me the craziest was, you know, I went into this thinking, oh, it's going to be 50-50. He'll do pickups, I'll do drop-offs, you know, whatever it is. And it didn't work out that way. And then I finally realized, well, if I'm in charge of making everything happen, I can make everything happen in a way that suits me, which is what I did. So I got help and I arranged schedules and I figured it out. My husband would be like, oh, you're not going to be around. I'm like, no, I'm not. This is what's happening. This is who's doing it. This is your role in it. I'll see you later. So if you are kind of getting this, it's all up to you stuff, you can be angry about it, or you can sort of use it to your advantage. And there's a wonderful book, which I can highly recommend. It's called How Not to Hate Your Husband After Having Children, which which I think is great. The last thing I would say is, get help, get help. There are plenty of other mothers in this boat. There are plenty of other women who can be helpful. And sometimes I think we don't take enough advantage of the help that we have. So as an example, I had a kind of a pod, I guess, of a couple of other women that worked, but also a couple of women that were like neighborhood moms who stayed at home. And what we figured out was there's this fantastic division of labor. Like, if I was picking my kids up from daycare, my friends' kids were at the same daycare, I can fit them in my minivan, right? So that's one less trip she has to do that particular day. Or the stay-at-home moms, right? Like, okay, no, I can't do the cupcake party at school in the middle of the day when I'm in New York City and you're in Princeton. But I could make you photocopy flyers for the thing that you need to have happen for the PTA. I could do that. So I think there's also an opportunity to think about what resources do you have that could be helpful to other parties that could create some kind of alliances. But it's tough. It's always going to be tough because it's a big job and it's very emotional and half your brain is like, there. I mean, I can tell you since my kids kind of migrated out, I feel like my head has just been able to expand because I don't have like this little thing in my head going, black socks. Do we have black socks for football? Is there, that checklist we all have in our minds? And it's just kind of nice not to have that. And I'm kind of over on the other side of this where now my husband will startle me at my desk and I'll be like looking up and he'll be going, what were you thinking of for dinner? And I'm like, why would I be thinking of that? It's just kind of a different world, and I've probably gone too much in the other direction.
So we have another question from Janet, and it relates to the hybrid work model, but I think that there's an aspect of the balance for working moms as well. She says the hybrid model is causing an inflection on communication bandwidth. Phone contact is way down because few people are in office. How do you deal with the world where everything gets relegated to email communications because the personal factor is done, set, or gone? And we all know that it can be a lot less efficient. So again, for working moms trying to find that balance, I'm sure there's something there. But we'd love your perspective on everything emailed.
Well, I don't think that's all that healthy. So there was a really interesting study that was done by David Allen at MIT, and he was interested in information richness. That was one of his dimensions. And he compared it to how far apart research scientists were sitting every day when they were in their offices. And what he found was information sharing, information richness, very, very, very high, boop, 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 and then falls off a cliff. And the place where it falls off a cliff is once you're sitting more than 60 feet apart, it becomes much more difficult to share, tacit, ambiguous, non-crystallized information. And I have a really good friend who runs a little, it's an accelerator program for a large insurance company, and they're sort of a separate little group. And she said to me, this was relatively early in the pandemic. She said, when we were all here, everybody knew what was going on. Like everybody it's a small group, it's about 20 people. Everybody kind of knew what was going on. Everybody knew what the projects were. Nobody had to take a lot of time to explain. And she said, and now it's like every day is just one meeting after another. So I think the thing we have not cracked is how do we facilitate the sharing of this tacit, why does Joe always plug his thing in there? Why does it, why did that customer always enter the building like that way? That sort of stuff that isn't codified. Because if you think about it, email is very codified. It's text on a page. It's got a structure to it. It's got specific words. Now, it's very easy to misunderstand what an email is, but it's codified to some extent. It's not that kind of tacit, a look, a glance, a feel, a whatever. And I think we're sort of struggling right now. And by the way, nobody knows. We've got a continuum of opinions, but no facts about what has to be done in person. But I do think there is something about, I'll call it tacit knowledge, and things like apprenticeship programs. Why do we have apprenticeship programs? Why do we have mentee programs and training programs? It's because it's not about learn how to type a memo with the right margins. It's about when you're giving that memo to the person, look them in the eye and shake their hand. It's about that more tacit side of things. So one of the big question marks to me, and this is for working women, this is for young people in general, is where are they going to pick all that up? Like I hired a new employee probably about 3 months ago now, and she's remote, as we all are. And I have to tell you, it has been really, really hard. And I think part of it's that, I'm just not like, I don't know what her schedule is. She doesn't know what mine is. I don't know what her commitments outside home are. Whereas if we were both in an office, she'd come in at 9 o'clock and be like, here's what the day's going to be like. Here's the structure. Would you like to sit in on my meeting muckety muck over here? Because I think that would be good for your development. It'd be all this sort of informal stuff. And so I think we're still grappling with how do we build that into our structures when we have to be much more intentional about physically where we are. And I know, Arwen, you and I have talked about this, which is like in the middle of the pandemic, or even now, I could have a meeting that begins at 6, and that's with somebody who's in Africa. Then my 10 o'clock is with somebody in England. My 1 o'clock is with some European. As we move across the globe, I wind up with a 7:30 in Seoul. And what's been fascinating to me is like in the before days, if you had to travel places, like you would know between Tuesday and Thursday, you're not doing anything else but traveling to this one meeting, and maybe you fit in a few emails around the corner. But now it's just like this rush of stuff. So it's eliminated frictions, which is good in some ways, and in some ways, I think it doesn't give us again that tacit bumping around, kind of learning from each other by observing. Right, by being part of the meeting, by what's being in the room where it happens, and I'm not sure we've cracked that one yet. I don't think we've been explicit about that kind of knowledge. And now that I'm thinking about it, there's a huge body of science which says that tacit knowledge is actually where innovation begins. That it's that transmission of things that haven't been quantified or codified yet. That really is where a lot of innovation begins.
Looks like we have time for one more question for Rita. Anyone have one for her? All right, I'm going to take silence.
I'll have an offer, Arwen, just a quick offer, because I know we're nearly done. If any of you are involved in the innovation space and would like to see this tool that I'm developing, reach out. I'll set up a demo. The other thing I'm launching right now is innovation-related learning modules. I'm hoping to launch them in November. And what the first course is it's an introduction to discovery-driven planning. So how do you plan under uncertainty? And then 5 mini courses relating to different aspects of customer insight. So how do you do customer interviews? What do you do to create first prototypes? How do you create a digital dimension to your strategy? What about when the prototype doesn't work? How do you deal with failure? How do you segment customers? So my goal is to really help companies use those and they're quick. The longest video in them is 11 minutes long. So it's meant to be consumed sort of on the go at work, as you will, and to be able to pick up knowledge as you're going. So if you're interested in being one of the first cohort members to you and your company, if you like, to be part of that, I'm hoping for a mid-November sort of soft launch, and we'll do a couple of cohorts, and then probably for reals in 2022.
Spectacular. And having worked with Rita, I can definitely recommend anytime you can get with her. It's always enlightening. So I'm going to close out the meeting with something. I'll try not to cry as I read this. Your book, Seeing Around Corners, and I really wanted to share this with everyone. It's dedicated to both your mother and your daughter. And if I may quote it, you write, "In one of my last conversations with my mother, Helga Liana Gunther, she made a big effort to say something that was clearly important to her. I'm proud of you. It shouldn't have mattered that much, but it did a lot. She was extraordinary, a scientist when that was rare, a path-breaking researcher whose work was cited for decades after she completed it, and the heart and soul of our family. I'd like to pass her thought along. To our daughter, Anne, and the amazing women coming into their own along with her, I'm proud of you." So in the spirit of this message, and in keeping with Quorum's tradition of closing out every session with a call to action, what's one thing you'd like to see women, particularly women leaders, do to keep moving the needle forward in terms of gender parity, equality, and our mutual success, and/or our mutual success?
Open a door for someone to whom it is closed. You know, and I'll give an example. There's a wonderful Pulitzer Prize winning playwright who, what's her name? Blanking on her name right now, but she's working with a company called McCarter Theater, and I'm on the board there. Paula Vogel is her name. And she's decided to dedicate the last, this next period of her life to what a program she calls Bard at the Gate. And what it is she said, for decades now, she's trained brilliant young playwrights who didn't have a way of getting through the gate. They didn't go to the right schools, they didn't have the right network, they didn't have the right whatever, but immensely talented. And to her heartbreak, she would see them try and try and try, get shut out and not be able to make a living at their passion. They had to go do something else. And so Bard at the Gate is something she's funded, and now McCarter's helping with this, which is featuring the work of a playwright that she thinks has huge potential, but who is like unconventional, doesn't come through the normal channels, assembling a troupe of actors to put on a very low budget version of this, which then gets videotaped. But then that videotape can be used to, and it's not like a slick produced Netflix video. This is like a play reading, of a play. But that now gets used to circulate this work to people who might not otherwise come across it. And the vision for it is that the bard waiting at the gate, we're going to open the gate.
Fantastic. We do a lot of talking about opening doors, but it's not always really focused on people to whom those doors are closed. So I'm going to send everyone a big thank you, especially to you, Rita. We really appreciate you spending your morning. I don't know if anyone noticed, Rita's actually in a studio recording a class.
An online,
away from the
an online class for Columbia today. Yeah, I'm filming an online class for them. So I don't know if you can see my setup here. I'll show you. The thing on which my computer is sitting is a box. You see behind me is this sort of, here's a mirror, a makeup mirror, which has and behind me is like all this theatrical construction and stuff. It's pretty funny.
That's amazing. Well, Rita and Arwen, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. There were so many interesting pieces of information you shared. I found that hugely not only interesting, but inspiring. So thank you for that. There were some big moments about, exposing yourself to new things, which seems so obvious, but yet, we easily can all get into the rut of doing the same thing all the time. So that was incredible. And I loved your comment for, frankly, all of us women about trying not to be so hard on ourselves, whether we're mothers or not. I think we're all just so hard on ourselves. So thanks for reminding us about that we need to give ourselves a minute and in fact, be proud of ourselves. Arwen, thanks for sharing that end piece of Rita's, I'm proud of you. That notion is so beautiful. And I love that as almost an additional action item. So Rita threw out there that we should open a door for someone who, where opening that door is difficult. So I love that notion as our takeaway action. So thank you for inspiring that. And I would sort of add to that, how about if we make a point in the next couple of weeks, besides opening a door, to also tell someone how proud you are of them. I think that's just like such a gift. So thank you for inspiring both of those things. Last little, if we were here, Rita, I think we would